Hey everybody, here's a quick review of the second half of Economics of Education, just going through the big ideas because I know a lot of you are just looking for a little bit of additional review material. So I'm going to pull up the slides and we're going to go through them like real quick, cut through all the nonsense and just look at the big ideas from every chapter. Okay, here we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. All right. So in week 15, we did a little bit of a review of everything we've done since the midterm. The big ideas since the midterm are school choice, the idea that we can improve education by increasing school choice. What's school choice going to do? Well, after we talk about everything we've talked about from the first half of the semester, we want to remember that school choice is going to tend to increase educational attainment by giving people, families, and students access to choice. What's that going to do? It's going to do two things. It's going to increase competition between schools, and it's going to give students and families the choice to select a school that's going to match them better, match the students' needs better, match the family's requirements better, all of that. It's also going to break up the idea of the attendance zone, the idea that where you live dictates what school you go to. We talked about the budget constraint for the household, education spending versus spending on everything else. If you go to a public school, then it's beyond the budget constraint. If you go to a private school, it's going to be on the budget constraint. Vouchers are going to change the budget constraint by shifting it out, but only for school spending, not for everything else. School choice policies, we have a lot of them. Charter schools, open enrollment, private school vouchers, magnet schools, homeschooling. All of them are increasing in enrollment while public schools are decreasing, and the outcomes are different. Charter schools is the most popular, it's the most common. They all have different qualifications, different characteristics. They don't all affect the budget constraint, but they all exist, and they all have different results. When we look at the empirical evidence, we see mixed results on all of them. Chapter 11, test-based accountability, the idea that we can assess student achievement by standardized testing, and then hold schools, teachers, and programs accountable through that. We've seen it rise over time. There's mixed results on that too. So it's also going to affect school districts differently based on the distribution of teachers. Chapter 12, teacher labor markets. Hey, this is how teacher labor markets are supposed to work, but the reality is teacher labor markets don't work this way. Teacher wages are not determined by the value marginal product of labor. Demand for teachers is subject to a lot of different forces, secondary markets, complementarity of skills. The Roy model is going to reduce the probability that high-skilled workers enter teacher labor markets. Also, increased equity reduces the probability that high-skilled people enter the teacher labor market. Teacher unions are going to have an effect on teacher labor markets. It could be positive in the realm of union voice effects or negative from the rent-seeking side. There's also compensating differentials, incentive pay, and the principal agent model, big ideas from the teacher labor markets. The last big idea from teacher labor markets, in addition to teacher certification, is this idea that teacher certification is going to help us set a minimum standard for teachers, but also raise the cost of becoming a teacher. And that's going to make being a teacher harder. Teachers for America, common, super popular program that has shown to be very positive in terms of getting really good teachers into schools, but only for a year or two. The second half is the market for higher education, dimensions for higher education. The big idea here is heterogeneity. There are lots of different types of higher education schools. They differ based on whether they are profit-seeking or not, private or public, what kinds of degrees are offered, whether they focus on teaching versus research. There's a lot of variation. When we think about what colleges do, the main things are going to be teaching and research. It's going to be hard to measure. There's going to be incomplete and asymmetric information. It's going to be a mixed market. We're also going to see that the government plays a big role in higher education, both in the terms of the financial support for higher education and in the regulation of higher education. That's because it's going to be subject to a lot of government or market failures, not government failures. Market failures, economies of scale, positive externalities, credit constraints, economies of scope, lots of issues, in addition to those information asymmetries we talked about earlier. When we think about the history and structure of higher education, it's changed a lot over the last 100 years, surprisingly. We've seen college enrollment increase, diversity of the population increase, especially with respect to marginalized groups like people of color and women. We've also seen an increase in the digitalization of and the online options for higher education. Financing of higher education comes not just from tuition payments, but also from appropriations from the government, gifts and endowments, and grants and contracts. Net cost is different from the sticker price of higher education. We've seen them both change. Baumol talks about the Baumol hypothesis, or Baumol's cost disease. This is the idea that as technology raises wages in other markets, it's going to reduce the supply of workers in those markets that don't have a technology increase. And so we're going to see wages rise in every market. It's going to mean that the cost of labor increases in most markets as technology increases. Talked about this in the discussion threads on Canvas. Let me know if you have questions about that. We also see other reasons for tuition costs going up: administrative spending, consumption amenities, and there is a hypothesis that increased financial aid tends to lead to increased tuition because the university knows that students don't have to pay the full sticker price, so they'll raise the sticker price in response to rising financial aid. We can see some data about it here. The big idea for that comes from the idea of the Bennett hypothesis. Bennett is the one who said, hey, when financial aid goes up, universities increase their tuition in response. There's mixed results for that, but we can talk about that later. We tend to see endowments come from rich people. Surprising, I know. We also see that as funding drops, we do see tuition change in response because universities want to keep their population of students pretty high relative to that. The other way they'll handle that is with price discrimination. If tuition is pretty high and the quantity of students is pretty low, enrollment is low, they can lower tuition for some students to get to that capacity level of enrollment. Heterogeneity and stratification, we've talked about a lot. Flagship universities are 1 or 2 universities in a state that are the highest resource public universities. We see increased integration of regional markets. We see that completion rates vary very much by income. We see financial aid expenditure increase over time. We see an allocative inefficiency can be present. If the richest students are getting higher education, then it's not the people who will benefit the most, it's just the richest students. That means we are allocating education inappropriately. It's inefficient allocation because it's only going to the wealthiest, not the best. Why do low-income students tend to not go to college at the same rates as high-income students? Well, yes, there's the credit constraint, but there's also lack of information about what college costs, lack of information about how to access financial aid, and lack of information about the returns to higher education. Finally, paying it for a college, there's 2 kinds of equity. Vertical equity is when students pay based on their need across all income levels. Horizontal equity is when families pay based on their need, across the same financial level. Need-based aid is determined based on the family's contribution, family income, family assets, and that's subtracted from the cost of attendance. Student debt has risen over time. I know, surprising. College life has changed over time. The net price tends to go up. We also see that there's an increase in attainment for higher income groups. Not necessarily the highest performing groups. Peer effects are relevant, but it's really hard to measure them because you choose your peers choose you, and you change based on that. So it's really hard to set up a random control trial or measure the counterfactual. And then finally, we see fewer students spending all their time studying. More and more students are working through education. There's a mix of distribution of majors, and we see decreased diversity in majors like economics. While we see gender equity in a lot of places. Why do we see gender inequity and gender gaps in some? It could be in some majors we could see gender gaps because of preparation, preferences, or institutional barriers. Overall, though, we do see increased equity, and that's it. I will see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me on this speed round review.